So today we have a 2010 Ford Escape. It was brought here for a no crank condition. Customer said that some part was replaced in the steering column. Wasn't sure exactly what. But I turned the key to crank, and the odd thing is it doesn't feel like it's going all the way to the crank position. So the way I got it in the shop was I used a remote start button on the starter solenoid, because it's fairly accessible, and pushed the start button while I turned the key to crank and drove it in. Check engine light was on, but it's an evap code. So I'm going to have a look at some data in the computer. So I'm making a custom data list here so I could see if it's commanding it. Let's graph these three data parameters. So key switch position, starter motor relay, and starter motor control. Let's see what happens when I turn the key to crank. Nothing changes that I can see. So again, it feels like the ignition switch lock cylinder is not turning far enough. You don't have to try to find out exactly what they replaced. So just got off the phone with the customer, and they indicated that what was actually replaced was the ignition switch. In fact, I'm holding the original one in my hand. They left it in the cup holder. So unless this new ignition switch, and they said they put in a new original equipment one, unless it's failed, then there's something else going on. I did find a TSB from Ford regarding the bad steering column lock module. It's the housing that the ignition lock cylinder mounts in. The ignition switch snaps to it and has the linkage that connects the lock cylinder to the ignition switch. So there could be a problem with that. On Identifix here, there are quite a few cases of this, and most of them are ignition housing or ignition switch, and of course the ignition switch has been replaced. But before we get carried away, we're going to have to check the actual basic starter circuit. She said she just kept fiddling with it and it would actually crank, but I couldn't get it to work at all, and I had to hot wire the starter at the starter motor itself, the S terminal in the starter, to get it into the shop. So we're going to look at the electrical circuit and make sure that there's power to the ignition switch and see how it's designed. So here's the starter motor control circuit, and it starts out with power from a smart junction box fuse 27, goes to pin 4 of the ignition switch and out in position 3 to the start diode and off to the starter motor relay. The relay is ground side controlled by the PCM when it sees all the correct inputs. I imagine it has to see transmission range and all that stuff, but it did not record or did not show the starter motor command on the scan tool. So I'm thinking we need to go back and verify this fuse, and we need to see if we have power on the blue-red wire and if it's leaving on the blue-white wire. So I've removed the covers from the top and bottom of the steering column. So that blue-red wire should be power from fuse 27, and it is. And it should leave on this blue-white wire when the key is turned to crank. So we're going to connect a test light to this blue-white wire and see if we have power when we're turning the key to crank. So I've got a jumper wire attached to the back of this blue-white wire, turning the key on and turning the key to crank, and no power on that wire. Let's see if we have it on this blue-white wire again. So I plugged in the original ignition switch, and I've got the key in the ignition, so the pass lock system will recognize it. And we turn the key on, and so there's a mechanical issue with this linkage that turns this switch. Like I said, it doesn't feel like it's turning completely. There's nothing wrong with this original switch. So I'm going to have to find out. This switch doesn't physically come out of here without removing this. Looks like the clock spring has to be removed because it won't physically come past this plastic part here. Way to go, Ford. You could have designed it so that it could have been serviceable right here. 2 minutes could have changed it. Oh well, we'll see what's involved in changing this housing that's in the bulletin. So the TSB I found from Ford refers to replacing this entire number 7 part here, which means disassembling the entire steering column. Number 7, part number 3511. I'm going to talk with the Ford dealer and see if they stock it. So I checked with the Ford dealer. That housing is like $200 and it's 3 days away. So I think we're going to remove the ignition lock cylinder. There's got to be some kind of a linkage or rod that goes between the end of the lock cylinder and the ignition switch on the other side. It almost seems that that is twisted, so it's not allowing enough travel. Now, to get the ignition lock cylinder out, you have to remove the passive anti-theft transceiver. It's clipped on the outside, and then there's a release pin like the old days. You put the ignition lock in the accessory position and press that lock pin to release it. We're going to give that a try. So remove the passive anti-theft transceiver, and now the picture shows the release pin on the bottom of the lock cylinder. It's actually on the top. So turn the key to the accessory position and push down through this hole up top here to release the lock cylinder. Now I'm looking at this lock cylinder and it doesn't look worn, and there's a D-shaped slotted hole in there that the lock cylinder fits into. Now that's got to be a mechanical white metal rod going through that allows the, or that turns the actual ignition switch. Well, look, it's looking more like we're going to end up replacing this entire housing. So I got the ignition switch hanging in the transponder for the PAT system, and I'm going to reach in here with a pair of needle nose pliers and grab that D-shaped part, turn the key to the accessory, and turn it to start. So there's obviously something wrong with the rod that connects to the actual ignition switch. It's not serviceable. There's a lot of slop in here, like there's some wear in here, and I think that's what's causing the lack of travel. So it looks like we're going to be changing that housing. Guess we'll order it up. So that's what the part looks like. It's actually part of the steering column lock assembly as well. So I imagine this is a steering column lock that activates when you turn the ignition switch off, it retracts, or on, it retracts, and when you turn the ignition switch off, it extends and locks the steering column. Geez, I wonder if that can be serviced without pulling the steering wheel off. Looking at this now, it might be possible. But it's underneath the steering wheel and underneath the clock spring, and it does come with the ignition switch. Unfortunately, they already replaced it, but you're going to get it. Like I said, there's a mechanical rod inside here that has slop and wear in it. When I turn it from the other side, the ignition lock cylinder doesn't turn far enough to completely rotate the ignition switch to the start position. So it's going to be a couple days before I get the new part, 2 to 3 days, and we'll finish it off. So I had a closer look at this, figuring maybe I can replace it without pulling the steering wheel off, but no, you can't, because the clock spring is bolted to it. There are several fasteners that go from the top down. But then I look at this clamp, and this clamp is held on with a break-off bolt. I know some imports used to do that. This bolt, when I get it, will have a head on it, and you torque it until it breaks the head off. Now it's like a rivet in there. So this has to be ground with a die grinder or drilled out and used an easy out. I'm going to try and cut it with a zip cut blade to put a slot in it so that we can remove it. Lovely. Oh well, we'll worry about that when we get the new part. So I got the new steering column locks assembly part today. Interesting, it didn't come with this fastener bolt that you torque in and break off, so I'm just going to use an Allen headed bolt in place of it. It's an 8mm bolt, so that should work just fine. In case you're interested, that's the part number there. The steering column has to come apart. So the first thing you want to do is remove or disconnect the battery, and then once the battery's been disconnected for 10 minutes or so, you can release this airbag assembly by inserting a small straight object in and pushing down on this release lever here on the back of that holds the airbag assembly in. But what they don't tell you is you have to push gently on the airbag towards the steering wheel as if you're trying to blow the horn, because there's these springs that are tempting to push it off and you're trying to release it from those 3 plastic tabs there. So that is a bit of a challenge. The instructions in the service literature are pretty vague, just says push. Doesn't say which direction, how, in, straight. Nevertheless, the next thing to do is to remove the steering shaft bolt, make sure that it's marked. If not, mark it. Remove the steering wheel, disconnect some wiring, and we'll pick up when we get to that lock cylinder. So once you remove that T50 bolt, there's usually a scribe mark in the shaft. I don't believe there's a master spline on this steering wheel, so you want to put a mark in line with that. Then put the bolt back in halfway, leaving about 1/8 of an inch play, and then rock the steering wheel side to side, pulling up on it, and you'll be able to pull it off the spline. If you can't get it, you can use a small 2-way puller and these bolts and push on the bolt. Once the steering wheel is removed, we want to be careful not to rotate this clock spring, because it will go out of time. So we're going to try to keep it in this position. Disconnect this connector. Actually, probably can leave that connector attached. Remove these 2 T20 bolts, screws, and take the clock spring off the steering column. So as I mentioned before, they use a bolt that busts off the head when they torque it down. So we're going to have to cut it with a zip cut blade so we can put a slot in it and hopefully get it out. So I've protected the dash with a rags from grinding from my die grinder. I'm going to try and die grind a slot into it. Something like that. A little crude, but let's give it a shot. So I cut a slot in it, came out with a standard stubby screwdriver. I'm surprised they didn't put Loctite on top of that. So this should be ready to come off. So there's a new part installed with the Allen headed bolt that I found and used. I could have probably reused this bolt here that the factory did, but whatever. That one's fine. There is another plastic housing that has to come off, and that's this one here. And now it has to go back on, and it's held on with 3 little retaining screws, one from there, one there, and one down here. So you have to get those off. So we're ready to reassemble this thing, at least far enough to make sure it works. So at first I thought it wasn't repaired because I turned the key and it wouldn't crank, and then I realized I didn't have the pass lock sensor around the ignition switch, so now it's fine. So reassemble everything and it should be good to go. I'm going to put the covers on before I put the steering column back together. So there, it's all back together again. Horn works. Check engine light is on because of an evap problem. It says it needs an oil change. I can't remember if the customer authorized that or not. I'll have to talk to them. And otherwise, it's good to go. I suppose they have a couple of good ignition switches, because that cylinder housing came with the ignition switch.